must say that in some ways I'm a fraud because the real person who should be doing this is Fred McMahon, who's just arrived and is heading the Economic Freedom of the World project at the Fraser Institute. I'm just now working on a book on the history of the Fraser Institute, and the title of the book, at least the working title, is The Fraser Institute, a place where people come to change the world. And we have been very, very fortunate over the course of the past 45 years to attract an enormous array of wonderful people from many, many countries to our project of trying to change the world. And one of the most effective has been Fred McMahon. And I would like you to join me in giving Fred a round of applause for all the work that he does in this area. It also gives me great pleasure to be at the inaugural annual celebration of economic freedom within the Parliament of the EU. While we meet here as it is now, it's important, I think, first to remind ourselves of why this institution came to exist. And I am constantly reminded by my friend Antonio Martino, whose father, Gaetano Martino, was one of the signatories of the first 6 countries who formed the European Economic Union to create greater economic integration in Europe. And their objectives, what was the objective of Gaetano Martino? The objective was to pursue peace through economic cooperation. That he and most of his colleagues had lived through the most incredibly difficult times in Europe, and they wanted to put that to an end, and they sought to do so by creating this institution. And for all of its difficulties, and parliaments of different kinds have difficulties, we must remind ourselves that it has been an enormously successful project. The Pax Europa for the signatories has been a tremendous success, and we mustn't allow ourselves to forget that while we are critical of the choices that people have made with regard to the policies. Now, I have written a paper, which is a technical paper, looking at the performance of the European Union in the course of its various manifestations over time. And I have decided not to give that paper here this morning because it's a technical paper and it's inappropriate, I think, to the circumstance. And so I would be happy to let you have that paper if you want it. But I'm going to rather use the few moments that I have to tell you something of the history of why the economic freedom of the world developed to where it is now, and what were the circumstances in which it evolved. How many here have read the novel 1984? Quite a number, yeah. So, in 1984, the Mont Pelerin Society had a meeting in Cambridge University, which was looking at the novel 1984 from the point of view of whether or not George Orwell had been prescient in his outlook. And Paul Johnson, the recently retired editor of the New Statesman, gave a paper entitled 1984, A False Alarm. And I was asked to give the commentary on his paper. And his paper said, well, you know, George Orwell was not really prescient. Nothing like this dystopian future has descended upon us by 1984, and everything is great. So I did some research about George Orwell's thinking? What was it that George Orwell had in his mind when he wrote this dystopian novel? Novelists, of course, are not economists. They don't, and they're not political scientists. They write to both to titillate as well as to inform people. And I discovered that the reason why George Orwell wrote his famous book was because he had been given the task as a journalist to review 2 books for The Telegraph, which was his newspaper. And one of those books was Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. So I then thought, well, if I were George Orwell and I had read The Road to Serfdom and had become imbued with the notion that this project of expansion of social welfare programs and this kind of thing, that this was ultimately a very destructive thing, how would I make people awaken people's interest to that? Well, I would write a dystopian novel much along the lines of the one that he had written. And so what I did in my reaction to Paul Johnson's rather cheery assessment was to point out that Hayek's concerns were rather more reflected in what we then observed in society, and that we should begin to measure carefully, well, that we should think about the level of economic freedom rather than focus on political freedom, because without economic freedom, there can be no political freedom. Now, what was very interesting about that meeting held so long ago was that we had assembled most of the well-thinking people of the day, and the rest of the meetings of the Mopeller Society meetings were focused, in effect, around this issue of what did we know about economic freedom? How important was economic freedom? Was it important at all? And so on. And as a result of that, I was able to persuade Milton and Rose Friedman to join with me in creating a better body of understanding about economic freedom, because it became evident that we did not have any kind of clear notion of economic freedom and its importance. Now, I don't wish to be pessimistic, but I do think that some of the things that are happening in the world today have to lead us to believe that perhaps some of the concerns that George Orwell raised, well, let me. I should have gone through my technical paper instead of ad-libbing it here, because I'm going to go off into. I don't have time to address that topic. Let me instead focus on the message that I would like to bring to you as you try to follow this tradition of investigation of the importance of economic freedom, and to bring it more into the discussions here at the European Union. And that is to focus on measurement, to make the Economic Freedom of the World Index the center of your attention. And the reason is because measurement, as opposed to philosophical argument, is a much more powerful way in which to proceed. Let me tell you of a recent experience because of my exposure to another wonderful man in the audience here, Salim Al-Ismaili, who has been leading the economic freedom of the Arab World Project and measuring outcomes in the Arab world now for 15 years. We had the opportunity to go and meet with people in Iran. And as we were preparing to go into that meeting, I thought to myself, if I were to go into this discussion with a philosophical discussion or a cultural discussion or any other kind of discussion other than an empirical discussion about what should happen in Iran, I would be dead. And the conversation would have been very brief, because I don't have anything in common with these people. I don't have much understanding of their ethos. And so by being able to go into that discussion with, armed with an empirical measurement of how Iran performed relative to another 158 countries, we could have an informative and I think very effective conversation about what should happen in Iran. And Iran is in the process of change, I think, as a result of that. So I would, my advice to you as you set out on this very important program of an annual review of economic freedom is to focus on the empirical measurement, to leave value judgments to other people, and to simply focus on the comparative assessment of the countries of the European Union relative to the rest of the world. I don't think well, perhaps I should make a few comments about what the results are for the economic union, for the European Union. Most of the index, of course, relates to there are 5 components of the Freedom Index: the rule of law, the size of government, and 3 other areas which are largely, in the case of Europe, under the control of a joint agreement in the Union itself. And so there's no variation of any particular kind in those 3 areas. But in the area of the size of government and in the rule of law, I think that the results, which I should probably have focused on in my remarks, the results indicate that the European Union is doing very poorly. If ranked as a single country, the countries of the Union in the size of government would rank as 123rd in the world, as if they were regarded as a single country. That is a very, I think, should be a very disturbing realization, and I hope that by carrying on your project of getting people to focus more on economic freedom, taking the Economic Freedom Index more into the public debate, that you will be able to focus people back on the important things for the future of the. I'm very sorry. I've given a very, very bad talk here this morning, and I should have stayed with my technical lecture, and I have not. I've not done you well, and I haven't represented Fred and his activity well here this morning, and I apologize for that. But I would suggest if you want the technical stuff, read it in my paper. The more philosophical issues, the issues that I wanted to talk to you about, I realized as I started to talk that probably you already are persuaded of that. You're already persuaded about the importance of measurement compared to having value discussions. You know, the central message I was going to give you this morning and was that I've spent my whole life dealing with people with whom I had a completely different value. I had a completely different set of values than they had. And so what, and Milton Friedman, of course, was in exactly the same position. And so what both he and I were trying to do was to recognize that the gulf of value differences can a bridge can be built across the gulf of value differences using empirical stepping stones. That if you can get people to agree on certain empirical regularities, certain empirical findings, then you have the opportunity to get across the value gulf and have a conversation about what things are important. And so as you go forward with your project, please stay with measurement. Because in this room, as it normally meets, the differences, the religious differences, the political differences, all of those differences will confound any opportunity that you might have to have a constructive conversation about change, unless you can find those empirical stepping stones and get a gradual agreement about the first one, and then get an agreement about another one, and then you can gradually move to a position where we have been very successful around the world in getting people to move eventually. But you will not get there in waving books by Bastiat, or talking about the Aristotelian versus so-and-so's view of the world. It has got to be on the basis of empirical, measurable, and therefore potentially agreeable things about the world that you both live in. And so if you can get people to come to an understanding and to come to an agreement about empirical things, you then have the opportunity to build the bridges that you need to have to get policy change. And so that was the message, only message I really wanted to come here with this morning, and then my jet lag and a variety of other things. And so thank you very much for honoring the Fraser Institute with your concern with economic freedom. And I hope that you will go forward for years, and I hope I'll be able to come back here in 10 years' time and see that everybody's been won over to the ideas of economic freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I appreciate it.